A lot of people have this question, should I put a 10% down or a 20% down? Let's settle this debate once and for all with real numbers and calculation and not just guesswork. My mission is simple. I want to retire 1 million immigrants with $5 million. Whether it's stock investing, real estate, tax strategies, or smart money moves, every video on this channel is designed to build you wealth step by step. If you want to be part of that 1 million, all you need to do is hit the subscribe button. And let's grow together. Today's video is pretty simple. I'll be talking about 3 things, straight up numbers, no fluff, nothing. I'll talk about the basics, mortgage default insurance and interest rate. If you do a 10% versus a 20% down, one of the biggest determinants is the mortgage insurance that you have to pay, and that gets added onto your mortgage. We'll talk about that and what it is and when it triggers and what it does. Then we'll talk about the numbers, 10% versus 20%. You can do the same number, that 5% versus 20% as well, but I'll just, for simplicity, I want to take 10% versus 20%. And finally, we'll be talking about down payment in conjuncture with investing in the stock market. And I understand it might be very confusing, but it'll start to make sense by the end of this video. So do stick around, because I'll be giving real calculations, and what I'll tell you in the end could be the difference between you having $200,000 to $300,000 more in your bank account on retirement. So let's first talk about the mortgage default insurance, which is a really critical topic. I'll talk about what it is. It's an insurance premium you pay when your down payment is under 20%. If you're doing a less than 20% down, that's the insurance premium that you'll pay. It does not have to be paid upfront. It gets added on to your mortgage, but that is not necessarily a good thing, because you have to pay interest on that mortgage insurance as well for the next 25, 30 years, depending on the amortization that you take. So it's not a good thing. There's no refund. A lot of people think that there are refunds of mortgage insurance if you, let's say, do a lump sum deposit and make the down payment 20% on, move your equity to 20%. That is only in the case of US and not in Canada. I know that a lot of people actually look at US videos and think that Canada is the same. It's not. Once it's paid, it becomes part of your loan. If you're doing a less than 20% down, it is part of your loan and you cannot remove that. If you do a 5% down payment, you have to pay a 4% premium of the loan amount. So 4% of the loan amount that gets added to your loan amount. And if you're doing a 10% down payment, it's 3.1% premium. If you're doing a 20% down payment, it's 0% premium, because there is no mortgage insurance if you're doing a 20% down payment. It allows you to access lower interest rates because the lender's risk is backed by CMHC, Sagen, Canada Guarantee. These are the 3 insurance companies. CMHC is the most common that people know, but a lot of people don't know that most of the mortgages, actually CMHC is not they are the governing body, but they are not the one who is insuring it. But anyways, it's very counterintuitive, right? A lot of people find it very difficult to get their heads around this. If you're doing a more than 20% down payment, your interest rate will be higher. I know it's counterintuitive, but the reason is that if you are doing a more than 20% down payment, and if you default on the loan, the risk rests entirely with the bank. So bank actually loses money. But if you're doing a less than 20% down payment, CMHC actually insures that mortgage. And if you default, if you are a less than 20% down payment, if you did that and if you default on your loan, bank has zero risk, because everything is insured by mortgage insurance that you paid out of your pocket. It got included in the mortgage, but you paid and it got added to your loan upfront. That's the reason why banks are able to give a little bit more discount if you do a less than 20% down payment. So it looks very counterintuitive. It sounds weird. It sounds like you are being penalized for doing a higher than 20% down payment, but that's not the case. You're just getting a discount because the bank has no risk if you're doing a less than 20% down, because the mortgage is insured and they have zero risk. I hope that was clarified. I think there's a lot of confusion around this, and hopefully it got clarified here. So all in all, if you're doing a 20% down payment, you do not pay any mortgage default insurance, but you get a worse rate. And if you're doing a less than 20% down payment, let's say a 10% down payment, you are paying a mortgage default insurance, but you are getting a slightly better rate. Now the question here is, which of the 2 scenarios is better? And we don't have to guess this. We can actually run the maths on this. Now, obviously, if you do not have the 20% down payment, this mathematics that I talk about in this video actually does not make sense for you. It's just for information. But if you have 20% down payment saved, and if you have that question whether to keep that 10% additional for a rainy day or to invest that in the market, versus if you do the 20% down payment and, take a lower loan, which one is better, then this video will put things into perspective. The mathematics that I talk about will be very, very relevant. But if you do not have 20% down payment, you can actually quit this video right now or watch it for information. So let's talk about this 10% versus 20% down payment, the numbers. If you're doing a 20% down payment, I want to talk about 20% down payment first, because you are someone who has a 20% down payment, and therefore I want to talk about that scenario first. Let's assume that you have a purchase price of $800,000. The down payment is 20%, which is $160,000. There is no mortgage insurance here because you're doing a 20% down payment, and the total loan, let's assume, is $640,000 after doing the 20% down payment. Let's assume a 5-year variable rate here. Now the rates don't just take this as your rate. It could be lower, it could be higher, depends on your situation, depends on when you're watching this video. The important thing is the differences that I make. It's not the absolute, right? So it does not matter whether it's 3.85 or 2.85 or 1.85. The difference would almost be the same. So let's assume that you're taking a 5-year adjustable variable rate, and that's at 3.85%, and the amortization that you have taken is 30 years. So you have taken a 30-year loan. The mortgage payment is close to $3,000. It's $3,001. The total payments across 30 years, including your principal and the interest that you pay, so 3,001 multiplied by 12 for an entire year multiplied by 30 years. So in 360 months, you would be making payments worth $1.08 million and some change. If you look at the interest that you pay in the first 5 years of the mortgage, which is your initial term, it will be about $115,000. Yes, it's a lot. That's the cost that you pay, and a lot of the interest actually is front loaded. That's how banks make money. And the total interest in 30 years will be about $440,000. It's crazy, right? 25% of the interest is actually more than 25%, of the interest is actually taken by the bank in the first 5 years. That's bizarre, but that's what the numbers are. Now, let's compare this against 10% down payment. Let's assume that you do not do the 20% down payment. You actually save the other 10%, which is $80,000. And the purchase price is the same. The down payment is now 10%. You do add mortgage insurance. It's an expense to you, $22,320. You just add that into your loan, and the loan becomes $742,320. So you're taking almost $100,000 more of loan. Of that, $22,000 is in fact the mortgage insurance. The rate, like I said, it will be lower because now the risk is not with the bank, it's with the insurer, and therefore they are able to give you a higher discount on prime. And the rate, let's assume, is 0.2% lower. It could be, in fact, a little bit lower than that even. I've seen 0.3 and 0.4% differences as well, but let's assume 0.2%, which is very conservative. The amortization, again, is 30 years. You can do a 30-year amortization. A lot of people still think they can't, but as per the rules that came out earlier this year, you can actually take a 30-year amortization even if you're not doing a 20% down payment. The mortgage payment will be higher. It will be $3,396, so almost $3,400. The total payments, it's almost $400 difference, so it's a significant difference. If payments are important, then obviously go for the higher down payment. But if you can take the little bit of more negative cash flow, then this may be a better option, and we'll talk about why. Total payments, 30 years, you'll be paying about $1.2 million. So clearly, you're not better off here. The total interest that you pay in 5 years is $126,000. The total interest that you pay in 30 years is $480,000. And you also pay on top of this the mortgage insurance. If you add 480 plus 22, you will be paying almost $500,000 in interest and fees alone, which is a lot more than 440. So it's $60,000 across the next 30 years, depending on who you are. It could be a lot of money. It may not be a lot of money for you. But yeah, that's the amount of interest that you pay additional if you do a 10% down payment, because you are taking a bigger loan. However, it's all mathematical, but it just amazed me when I did the calculations. Now, let's assume after you close your mortgage, in the first month of you making payments, you actually make the other $80,000 that you saved. So let's say you did not do a $160,000 down payment. You actually held back the $80,000. You made an $80,000 down payment. And on the next day of closing the home, you actually put $80,000 back into your mortgage. So what happened was that you did pay the mortgage insurance, but you got a lower rate, and then you put the $80,000 back into the mortgage. So these scenarios are not very different. You actually put the same amount of money in both these scenarios, just that you put $80,000 after you close the mortgage. So it's like a prepayment that you do towards your mortgage. All banks except for one allows for more than 10% prepayment, and that bank is RBC. I don't have any, problem saying that. RBC allows for 10% prepayment, but every other bank allows for more than 10%. Most of the banks allow for 20%. In this case, in the next 30 years, you will be paying almost the same amount of payments, interest plus principal, which you were paying if you did the 20% down payment. So there's absolutely no difference here. In the first 5 years, you'll almost be paying the same amount of interest, $113,000. But in the next 30 years, like over the course of your mortgage, it's not actually 30 years, but I'll talk about that in a bit. You'll be paying an interest of $344,000, plus you pay $22,000 in mortgage insurance. So that's about $360 something thousand of interest plus fees. But the big thing here is that even though you are paying the same amount of money in principal and interest over the course of your mortgage, you are paying off this loan because you made a lump sum deposit. You are paying off this loan in 24 years and 9 months. So you're saving 5 years on your mortgage. Now that's the crazy calculation, but it's all mathematical. The reason why you see this difference is because we have taken a lower interest rate here at 3.65% versus a 3.85% over the next 25-30 years that you are paying your mortgage. It's not magic, it's all mathematical. Now some of you amazing people might say that the mortgage payment is $3,000 here, it's $3,400 here. What if I invest the $400 of difference? I do the 20% down payment, but I actually, put the additional $400 that I saved by not doing the 10% down payment back into the stock market and it grows. Honestly, that's not how I have seen people operate their life. Usually they don't do a 10% versus a 20% calculation. The $400 additional that they saved, that actually goes into expenses, or they do, something else with that money. I have rarely seen someone do both these calculations and try to get ahead. Obviously, if you invest the difference, you'll probably be ahead. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. But that's not how life works. And if you save $400 in mortgage payment, I don't think you'll put that back in the mortgage. Most people, I should not generalize this, but most people won't do that. And that's why I feel that that argument, even though it's true mathematically, it might not hold true for most of us who buy a home. So should you do a 10% down payment? It all depends on what you value more. First of all, if you're doing a 20% down payment, are you doing it comfortably, or are you putting everything, including your emergency fund, back into this down payment just to not pay the mortgage insurance? If that's the case, we are not ready to buy a home, especially not with 20% down. The other thing is your monthly cash flow, because if you're doing a 20% down payment, obviously your monthly payments will be a lot lower, almost 10%, more than 10% lower. And if you value a lower monthly payment, then 20% down payment might make sense for you. And third, and probably the most important question is that if you are choosing to do 10% down when you have a comfortable 20% to put down on your home, what are you doing with the additional 10%? In this case, the $80,000 that we talked about, the additional $80,000 that we have, what are you planning to do with that $80,000? Let's run the maths on that next. Now we have the same two scenarios, the 20% down payment, the 10% down payment. The only difference is that $80,000 that we are saving here, we are not just putting back into the home. What we are doing is that we are putting that $80,000 into S&P 500. You can put it into whatever, but let's just take S&P 500 as an example. For 30 years at 8% year-on-year return, 8% is actually very conservative. The last 20-25 years, it's 10%, over 10% in fact. And in the last 30 plus years, it's over 8%. So 8% is very conservative. It could be a lot more than that. But let's take 8%. If you invest that $80,000 lump sum, when you close your mortgage into S&P 500, instead of putting, a 20% down payment, the end balance at the end of 30 years will be $800,000, and it will be over $1 million if you do a 10%, compounding on that. The total gain will be about $725,000. It's a simple 805 minus 80,000. So $725,000 is the total gain that you have. And if you look at the difference, you paid about $480,000 in interest. You gained about $725,000. Even if I include the $22,000 of mortgage insurance, you are ahead by almost $225,000 net worth wise. So technically, mathematically, it does make sense to invest the $80,000. And we already know that, right? The interest rate on this is, under 4%. The return on your stock market gains on positive compounding versus the reverse compounding is a lot higher. So it makes sense. These numbers make sense. It's just mathematical. On the other hand, you might say that, there's a difference of $400 almost between these two scenarios. So instead of doing an $80,000 down payment and paying the mortgage insurance, I would actually want to pay the 20%, but invest the difference between these payments. So let's assume that you are someone who has done this calculation and you are investing the $395 dollars a month in S&P 500 for 30 years at 8% year-on-year return, total contributions that you had made in the next 30 years will be about $142,000. The end balance at 8% year-on-year return after 30 years will be about $556,000, and you can run the math with any calculator. I'm just like putting the result here. The total gain that you'll have is $414,000. So you would pay about $440,000 in interest, and you will gain about $414,000 in total gains on the stock market. Plus, these gains are taxed. If you sell this, you will have capital gains as well. Now, if you look at this comparison, clearly scenario number 2 is way better if you do a 10% down payment and invest the difference. And it's not magical, right? It's just mathematical. If you put $80,000 today and let it compound for 30 years, it's just better than, like dollar cost averaging. It's just mathematically better if you put, like a lump sum today and it just compounds for 30 years versus if you dollar cost average across 30 years, you will be making more contributions and the returns will be lower. But overall, you still make an 8%, year on year. It's called an XIRR. Technical terminology is XIRR. But if you look at these two scenarios, you will be way ahead if you do scenario number 2. So does that mean that you should never do a 20% down payment and always invest the difference? Mathematically, yes, because that's how compounding works. But it's not always about maths for everyone. Some people value the peace of mind that a lower loan amount comes with, and they would want to be debt-free as soon as possible. A lot of times we think that mortgage agents and banks are only about rates. And for the most part, they are. But there is a little bit of science behind this, and that science can be different depending on who you are. Some might value the lowest rate, some want the lowest amount of mortgage, and some want to rent forever. No one is wrong, and it just depends what you are doing with the difference and what you want from your life and retirement. If you want to learn more about the home buying process, I made a free masterclass. The link to that is in the description. And if you are someone who is in the market looking for an amazing deal, the second link in the description will be a link to a WhatsApp group. It's called the Value Deals group, where I'm posting power of sales, which you can actually get way below market value because the sellers are desperate to sell. That's all I have for today. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय.